you hardly have any museum director on this planet who can actually both do historical exhibitions and contemporary exhibitions. They are expert for contemporary art and they're expert for historical art. And more you have a fundraiser who runs the institution, you know, and the director of the museum has nothing to do anymore with the content. So that all, you know, doesn't really improve the picture. But there are still, you know, there are always a few places where there is a constellation which is interesting. But then to your question about the art fair, I actually, you know, there's a whole discussion obviously among my friends all the time if one should go to art fairs. And most of my friends don't go to art fairs. Artists, you know, Philip will go back tomorrow, he hates art fairs, right? So most artists don't go to art fairs and so on. But I've always believed that art fairs are not that uninteresting. For the simple reason is that actually they kind of, you know, you see a lot of work in one spot, right? And there is actually a lot of, particularly in Basel, like in a few other art fairs, there are these statements, which are like projects, where galleries really give artists a one-person show. And this, you know, in the regular case, is a great situation where you have very young artists given a whole space and doing a big one-person project. So to see it is actually like to see a huge, you know, Kunsthalle exhibition. You really see new practices somehow emerging. The other thing which is interesting about, you know, about the art fair, I mean, that's for very practical reasons. I mean, if that thing would have happened in, you know, Italy or in France, I wouldn't have made you travel all the way to Basel, you know, that wouldn't be the point. But what's interesting is that we do this thing here at the same time as, you know, the Basel Art Fair happens. The opening was today, and you know, and there is a lot of people who are actually going to, you know, to Basel. Among them, several people whom I wanted you to meet. So it's a very practical reason, you know, to sort of basically organize those meetings. And the thing also, I mean, to finish on that, which I thought when I was invited here, you know, I mean, I wasn't really invited to do a lecture. I'm replacing here my, you know, colleague Philippe Pareno, who is writing a text as we speak. So that lecture wasn't really prepared because I was never supposed to do a lecture. It wasn't kind of announced on the program. But you know, I saw my role here actually as a curatorial role. You know, I'm not a philosopher. I'm familiar with Mr. Gadamer's ideas. You know, because he was actually very influential for my interview book. I have an interview with him in the book where he said one thing very beautiful which I wanted to add to your comment about conversations, where he actually said the most important thing about conversations are silences, kind of moments of silence. It's a bit related to what I said about museums maybe, and silences. But you know, when I was invited here, I'm not, you know, a philosopher, and I'm not an art theoretician, and I'm not an artist. You know, my practice is to curate exhibitions. So when I do seminars, I curate those seminars, which means I invite, you know, artists to those seminars. So we have Philippe Pareno here today, we have Anton Vidocli and Eliasson, and that's what I do with my regular seminar in Venice. You know, the Venice University has invited me to run this seminar, you know, on a weekly basis, and basically there we see this as a curatorial space. So the first thing we did for this seminar, that's one of the things I should maybe mention because I haven't mentioned it before in the series of sort of knowledge producing kind of projects which I'm involved with. The main thing we decided is to actually combine my art seminar, which is about allestimento di mostre, so it's about exhibition design, it's about history of exhibition design, to combine that with the architecture faculty. So to have actually the architectural view on exhibition design and the history from the architects on that. And so we have architects and artists joining the same seminar. That was step one. So we do this together with Stefano Guerri. The second step is that my role is to invite, you know, on a very regular basis, artists to this seminar. So again, you know, is to invite.
How does a communication or conversation goes beyond expressing viewpoints and maybe have some interest in the viewpoints of the other? But how do they have enough space and time really to go into a clinch and to questioning each other? Is that happening in such an environment?
Yeah, I mean, the talking always leads to doing something together.
Yeah,
you know, I think that's the difference.
Thinking first, you know, thinking is doing in our world.
I mean, there is a reflection going on usually for 2 months about, you know, what exhibition we do. So, you know, what exhibition is necessary. So we go through all kinds of exhibition models. And at the end, there is a realization of a show. So the thinking goes first. And so I think in a certain way, what is always very important is to sort of look at artist projects which cannot happen in, you know, a sort of a given context. So we've published a series of books with Kita Tosa called Ambient Worlds. So basically, you know, investigated into what artists have as projects. We've been looking at many unrealized artist projects, you know, which cannot happen within the given framework of museums or galleries, you know, and what would have to change for that project to be realized. So that's one possibility, no? To deal with
That's
this.
physical parameters?
Sorry?
That's just physical parameters?
Yeah, economic parameters, physical parameters, institutional parameters, legal parameters, there can be all kinds of parameters. No? Why a project cannot happen.
No freedom. Okay. I only make it short because we have many other questions.
Yeah.
You want to go on working someplace else, so we really have to.
Then the exhibition,
have a
you know,
structure.
where, yeah, obviously the 20th century is a century of, you know, where the exhibition basically became very much the medium. So one can say, you know, art of the 20th century is an art of the exhibition. So that's maybe answering your other question. Yeah. And nothing is really clear. But what is clear is that there is a quite, you know, radical change happening right now. And what it obviously leads to is, it leads to the fact that all kinds of new institutions pop up. You know? It's a period of big transition. It just describes Immanuel Wallerstein. No? I mean, he describes in his book Utopistics that we're in a late moment of capitalism, and we are not yet, you know, it's going to take 30 or 50 years until we get rid of the system, or the system will collapse. It's going to take a long time, as Wallerstein describes. So it will be a long period of transition, and in this long period of transition, you know, there will be all kinds of new negotiations. So I don't think that, I definitely am very pessimistic about the American museum situation, just because of that reason that it's one, but I think, you know, what can happen is very much a sort of a third way, because the American system also has advantages. You know, it's just that in terms of programming it doesn't, but in terms of funding, you know, you have a very solid funding, and you know, it cannot just suddenly collapse.
So is Europe becoming like America?
No, I think, you know, there can be negotiations for a third way, and that might very well happen in Asia. So I'm actually extremely optimistic that there can be extremely interesting museum types emerging now in Asia. I mean, I'm working a lot in China right now, and also in other parts of Asia on, you know, new museum concepts. And I think such negotiations for a third way, you know, which wouldn't necessarily be in the European model, not the American model. Asia is extremely at the moment on that point. And I mean, you know, Shanghai on itself, the city of Shanghai will build 100 museums by the year 2010, 100 new museums. So there's a quite good opportunity and possibility that there will be some, you know, interesting new types of museums. But I wanted to answer
The truth in art. You want to answer the truth in art if you still think this is something which enters your own horizon when you curate art?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, you know, we would, you know, wouldn't be doing that work if there wouldn't be permanently that.
Because I'm just a bit concerned, because if you forget about truth, then the possibility of evil arises, and art becomes a function of the power that be, all the possibilities arise. Is there hope in Europe?
Sorry?
Is there hope? Can we find hope in art, in the third possibility?
No, I definitely think so, yes. And it's a lot to do with, you know, what I've been describing to you before, and that is a bit the answer to your question, you know, because I think there was a misunderstanding, and, you know, maybe I wasn't clear, that led to that misunderstanding. But I'm saying, you know, that there are like 7 or 8 places in the world, you know, that obviously doesn't mean that there are only 7, 8 interesting exhibition spaces. There are hundreds of interesting exhibition spaces. What I meant is, you know, we're talking about the large-scale museum, the complex large-scale museum. We're talking about the machine, the big museum where you have historical exhibitions, contemporary exhibitions, you know, the sort of Pompidou, MoMA kind of type of museums, you know. And what I've been saying is that there is an increasing difficulty of those institutions, you know, to in a certain way, you know, be meaningful. And what obviously happens is that you have a lot of institutions all over. You have artist-run spaces, you know. I've been working a lot with artist-run spaces throughout the 90s. By bringing them into exhibitions, and you know, we have worked with a show on England where we basically just constituted the English scene by giving all the space to these incredibly exciting artist-run spaces which exist all over the UK, which are run by artists. You know, you have all kinds of small or new offices, which is also very interesting, which are offices of production, where actually you have new ways of production, where, you know, production of art, and which are not necessarily commodified, but sort of different forms of production. You have at the same time, you know, laboratories which still are, you know, there's a lot of small contemporary art structures which you have structures at the same time, like, you know, INIBA in London, which are like institutions which in a certain way are more knowledge producing, which are building up archives. So, you know, you can have a whole map. And what is interesting is that it's no longer only New York, Paris, London. But what is interesting, and that really only happened in the 90s to that extent, is that it's a total multiplication of centers.